Survival of the fittest usually means survival of the loudest, but in the deep past, your silence was actually the most valuable thing the tribe owned. Imagine you are sitting on the very edge of a small camp 40,000 years ago. The fire is a roaring, snapping beast in the center of the circle, throwing long, jagged shadows against the cave walls. Everyone else is leaning in, shouting, laughing, and reenacting the day's hunt with wide gestures and booming voices. They are thriving in the heat and the noise. But you are leaning back into the shadows where the air is cold. Your eyes aren't on the fire, they are fixed on the impenetrable blackness of the tree line. You haven't spoken in 3 hours, and to a modern observer, you look like a social failure. You look like the person who's about to be left behind when the group moves on at dawn. However, that modern observer would be dead wrong. In the harsh reality of the Pleistocene, that silence wasn't a lack of personality. It was a specialized survival tool that the rest of the group was relying on without even realizing it. You might think that being a wallflower in a primitive survival situation is a death sentence, but the truth is that the loud, aggressive alpha is a much newer invention than we like to admit. Our modern world is built for the talkers, the self-promoters, and the people who can dominate a room, but for 99% of human history, the social landscape looked nothing like a corporate boardroom. We have this deep-seated myth that ancient humans were led by the strongest, loudest man in the room, a brute who took what he wanted and shouted down anyone who disagreed. It's a clean, simple story that fits perfectly into a comic book, yet it falls apart the moment you look at the actual data from the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies on Earth. Consider the Tsimane people of the Bolivian Amazon. Researchers like Michael Gervin and Christopher von Ruten have spent years studying their social structures, trying to find the big 5 personality traits that we use in the West. What they found was a complete rejection of our model. In a small, tightly knit band where everyone knows everyone else's business, being an extrovert isn't actually a high-status trait. The Tsimane don't care how well you can tell a story if you don't have the meat to back it up. Their social hierarchy is built on 2 very quiet pillars, prosociality and industriousness. Prosociality is just a fancy scientific word for how much you help others without being asked, and industriousness is how hard you work when no one is watching you. Notice that dominance and talkativeness aren't on the list. In a survival setting, the person who sits quietly and naps flawless flint arrowheads for 6 hours is infinitely more valuable than the person who spends 6 hours talking about how great their next hunt is going to be. If you were a quiet person in the ancient world, you weren't an outcast. You were the person the group trusted to get the actual work done while the extroverts were busy managing their social standing. But if you think that silence was just a social preference, you're missing the biological weaponry hidden deep inside your own brain. The reality is that your introversion isn't a choice you made or a result of how you were raised. It is a physical, measurable sensitivity that is hardwired into your nervous system before you're even born. In the late 1980s, a Harvard psychologist named Jerome Kagan started a massive, decades-long study that changed everything we know about temperament. He took a group of 4-month-old infants and exposed them to new stimuli, popping balloons, colorful mobiles, and the smell of alcohol on a swab. About 20% of the babies had an intense physical reaction. They kicked their legs, arched their backs, and cried. Kagan called these high-reactive infants. You would think these fussy babies would grow up to be the bold, aggressive leaders of the world, but the result was the exact opposite. Those high-reactive babies grew up to be the quiet, cautious, and thoughtful introverts. Their brains were simply more sensitive to the world around them. Their amygdala, the part of the brain that scans for threats and processes emotion, was set to a higher frequency. They didn't need a loud noise to notice something was happening. They noticed the tiny change in air pressure before the noise even started. This trait is roughly 40% to 50% heritable, meaning it has stayed in the human gene pool for hundreds of thousands of years. If being quiet and cautious was a disadvantage, evolution would have scrubbed it out of our DNA before we even left Africa. Instead, it kept it in a perfect, steady 20% of the population. This is what evolutionary biologists call balancing selection. A tribe made entirely of bold, loud risk-takers is a tribe that walks directly into a lion's den because no one was paying attention to the grass moving. A tribe needs that 20% who are physically incapable of ignoring the small details. If you're an introvert, you are the descendant of the people who were built to notice the threat before it became a tragedy. Everything I just told you about biology makes it seem like introverts were just passive observers, but the truth is that your ancestors were the designated early warning system for the entire species. Think about the physical cost of being an extrovert in the ancient world. Daniel Nettle, a researcher at Newcastle University, has done extensive work on the fitness trade-offs of different personality types. His findings were startling. Extroverts, because they are driven by a higher need for dopamine and social rewards, take significantly more risks. In the modern world, that might mean a higher credit card bill or a reckless driving ticket. In the Pleistocene, that meant death by infected scratch, a fall from a cliff, or an encounter with a predator you thought you could outrun. Nettle found that extroverts have more sexual partners and higher social status, but they also have much higher rates of hospitalization and accidental death. The introverts, by contrast, survived by simply not being where the danger was. They were the sentinels. While the bold hunters were out chasing a wounded bison into a rocky ravine, the quiet ones were back at the camp, listening. They were the ones who noticed the subtle shift in the wind that meant a storm was coming 2 hours before the clouds appeared. They were the ones who realized the berries on the north slope were slightly different from the ones they ate yesterday. This isn't just a metaphor. Your brain actually processes information through a longer, more complex neural pathway than an extrovert's. While an extrovert's stimuli go through a short pathway that triggers immediate action, an introvert's stimuli go through the long pathway that touches the parts of the brain responsible for planning, memory, and error detection. You weren't shy. You were performing a high-level diagnostic on your entire environment every second of every day. But even if you were the best early warning system in the world, the tribe still had to decide if you were worth the food you ate. It's easy to assume that a communal society would eventually get tired of a member who didn't contribute to the loud bonding rituals of the group. But that's because we've forgotten how much work ancient life actually required. There is a persistent image of the Stone Age as a time of constant grinding labor, where every minute was a struggle for food. But in 1966, the anthropologist Marshall Solins turned that idea on its head when he coined the phrase the original affluent society. By studying groups like the Jusrahounsi in the Kalahari, researchers found that ancient humans only worked about 3 to 5 hours a day. The rest of the time was spent resting, talking, and crucially engaging in solitary tasks. In a hunter-gatherer band, there was no open office plan. If you needed to be alone to process your thoughts or work on a tool, you just walked 50 yards into the brush. No one followed you. No one asked if you were okay. In fact, many indigenous cultures, like the Western Apache, studied by Keith Basso, saw silence as a sign of high intelligence and emotional maturity. To the Apache, speaking when it wasn't necessary was a sign of a weak mind. If you met a stranger on the trail, you might sit in silence with them for half an hour before a single word was exchanged. This wasn't awkward. It was a way to gauge the other person's character without the distraction of words. If you were a quiet person in that culture, you weren't the weird one. You were the one everyone respected because you had the self-control to keep your mouth shut until you actually had something worth saying. In this light, introversion wasn't a social burden. It was a form of social capital that made the group more stable. However, the most haunting proof of how much ancient humans valued the quiet ones isn't found in their social rules, but in their graves. If ancient humans were the brutal, survival-of-the-fittest monsters we imagine, they would have abandoned anyone who couldn't keep up the moment things got difficult. But the archaeological record tells a story of almost unbelievable compassion. Take the case of Shanidar I, a Neanderthal man discovered in a cave in Iraq who lived about 45,000 years ago. This man was a physical wreck. He had a massive blow to the side of his head that likely left him blind in one eye and may have caused brain damage. His right arm was withered and had been amputated above the elbow. He had a debilitating bone disease in his legs that would have made every step an agony. He couldn't hunt. He couldn't defend the camp. He couldn't contribute a single calorie to the group's survival. And yet he lived into his 40s, which was a very old age for a Neanderthal. His tribe fed him for decades. They carried him when they moved. They protected him from predators. Why? Because the value of a human being in the ancient world wasn't measured by their physical output or their social dominance. It was measured by their presence, their memory, and their unique way of seeing the world. If a group would go to those lengths to keep a severely disabled man alive, the idea that they would ostracize someone just for being quiet is laughable. The quiet ones were the keepers of the deep knowledge. They were the ones who remembered where the water was during the last drought 20 years ago. They were the ones who knew the exact texture of the stone needed for a spearhead. They didn't need to be loud to be essential. They just needed to be there. But as we moved out of the caves and into the first cities, the rules of the game began to shift in a way that would eventually turn your greatest strength into a perceived flaw. As human populations grew and we moved into permanent settlements, the sentinel role began to lose its obvious value, but the biological machinery didn't go anywhere. In a small band of 30 people, everyone knows your worth. They know you're quiet, but they also know you're the one who found the leopard tracks before anyone else. In a city of 10,000, no one knows you. In that environment, the person who speaks first and loudest gets the resources. This is where the modern extrovert ideal was born. We started mistaking talkativeness for intelligence and charisma for leadership. But even as the world got louder, the introvert's brain stayed tuned to the old frequencies. Research into the neurochemistry of personality shows that introverts and extroverts are literally fueled by different chemicals. Extroverts are driven by dopamine, the chemical of reward and external stimulation. They need more and more of it to feel normal. Introverts, on the other hand, are much more sensitive to dopamine. They get overwhelmed by it easily. Instead, they rely more on acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter that is linked to the rest and digest system. Acetylcholine rewards us when we turn inward, when we reflect, and when we focus deeply on a single task. This is the biological reason why you feel exhausted after a party but energized after a long walk alone. Your brain is trying to get you back to the state where you are most effective, the state of the observer. Ancient humans didn't try to fix this. They didn't have self-help books telling introverts how to be more outgoing. They simply recognized that a healthy tribe needs both the people who hunt the bison and the people who listen for the wolves. They knew that if you lost the quiet ones, you lost your eyes and ears. Everything I've described so far suggests that introverts were a protected class, a respected part of the ancient hierarchy. But there was a darker, more pragmatic reason why the tribe kept you around, and it has to do with the most terrifying aspect of prehistoric life, the unknown. In a world with no maps, no science, and no safety nets, the unknown wasn't a concept. It was a physical place just beyond the firelight. The bold members of the group were the ones who went out to face that unknown. But they were also the most likely to never come back. If the entire tribe was composed of these high-risk individuals, the collective memory of the group would be wiped out every generation as the elders died in hunting accidents or territorial disputes. The introverts were the biological insurance policy. By being behaviorally inhibited, the scientific term for being cautious, they stayed alive long enough to become the living libraries of the species. They were the ones who survived the lean years and the failed migrations because they didn't take the unnecessary risks that killed the alphas. When a young, bold hunter wanted to cross a flooded river, it was the quiet elder who remembered the last time someone tried that and failed. Your introversion isn't a social glitch. It is a long-term survival strategy designed to keep the human story from ending in a single, reckless afternoon. You were the ones who ensured that the hard-won lessons of the past weren't buried with the bodies of the bold. But if you think that this role as a living library was a position of comfort, you're mistaken. Being the one who notices everything means being the one who carries the weight of everything you notice. In ancient times, while the rest of the group was sleeping soundly, exhausted from their social play and their hunting, the introvert was likely the one lying awake. Their brain, with its high reactive amygdala and its long pathway processing, would have been replaying the events of the day, scanning for errors, and imagining potential threats for tomorrow. This is the evolutionary root of what we now call anxiety. In the modern world, we treat anxiety as a disorder to be cured. In the Stone Age, that anxiety was a specialized form of intelligence. It was the ability to simulate the future before it happened. If you could imagine the lion in the tall grass, you could plan a route that avoided the tall grass entirely. The tribe didn't do anything to introverts. They gave them the space to be the group's collective imagination. They recognized that the person who was worried was often the person who was right. The problem is that in our current world, we have all of the ancient biological hardware for threat detection, but very few actual lions. We are sentinels with nothing to guard, and so we turn that powerful sensory system on ourselves. If you ever feel like you don't fit into the frantic, noisy pace of modern life, it's because you aren't supposed to. You are a biological relic of a time when the world was much larger and much more dangerous. The ancient world didn't try to change introverts because it couldn't afford to. It needed your heightened senses, your deep focus, and your ability to sit in silence until the truth revealed itself. Your ancestors weren't the ones being shouted at. They were the ones being consulted when the shouting stopped and the real problems began. They were the ones who sat at the edge of the fire, not because they were afraid, but because they were the only ones brave enough to look into the dark and actually see what was there. The tribe didn't tolerate your silence. They depended on it for their very lives. Every time you feel the need to retreat from the noise, every time you notice a detail that everyone else missed, and every time you choose caution over a reckless thrill, you are channeling a survival mechanism that has been polished for 1,000,000 years. You are not a broken extrovert. You are a highly tuned piece of evolutionary technology that has been temporarily misplaced in a world that has forgotten how to be quiet. The most profound reveal of our ancient history is that the quietest people were often the most powerful, not because they ruled, but because they understood. Knowledge in the Stone Age wasn't something you looked up. It was something you lived. And because introverts have a higher baseline of internal arousal, they lived the world more intensely than anyone else. To a quiet person 30,000 years ago, the rustle of a leaf wasn't just a sound. It was a narrative. The shape of a cloud wasn't just a shape. It was a warning. This intensity of experience is what allowed humans to develop the first complex tools and the first symbolic art. Many of the cave paintings we see today, hidden in the deepest, most silent recesses of the earth, were likely created by the people who needed to get away from the noise of the camp. They were the first shamans, the first artists, and the first scientists, because they were the only ones who spent enough time alone to actually think. The tribe didn't just carry you, they honored you by giving you the solitude you needed to bring back the secrets of the dark. So, when you look at the way the world is organized today, with its constant pings, its endless meetings, and its demand for permanent social performance, remember that this is the blink of an eye in the grand scale of human existence. For the vast majority of our time on this planet, we were a species that valued the observer. We were a species that knew the person who spoke the least usually knew the most. The alpha who dominates the conversation is a modern illusion, a byproduct of a world that has become so safe we can afford to be loud and stupid. But that safety is a fragile thing. When things truly go wrong, when the systems fail and the noise dies down, the world always turns back to the people who were quiet enough to see the trouble coming. You are the descendant of the survivors, the ones who didn't jump into the river without checking the depth, and the ones who stayed awake to watch the horizon. You might feel like a stranger in your own time, but that is only because your true purpose has been obscured by the flickering lights of a digital fire. Your silence is not a void. It is a reservoir of prehistoric data that the rest of the world is too distracted to access. The next time someone asks you why you're so quiet, or why you're standing at the edge of the room instead of the center, don't feel the need to apologize. You are simply doing what your ancestors did for 2 million years. You are holding the perimeter. You are watching the shadows. You are being the person the tribe will need when the laughter stops and the real work of survival begins again. You weren't an accident of history. You were the necessity that made history possible. The reality of your existence is far colder than the warm myth of social inclusion we like to tell ourselves today. Evolution did not preserve your introversion because it wanted you to be happy or because it valued your inner peace. It kept you quiet because a tribe that is entirely happy and relaxed is a tribe that gets eaten in its sleep. You are the product of a brutal, calculating selection process that decided some individuals must be born with a nervous system that never truly rests, just so the rest of the group can. You are not gifted with a sensitive soul. You are burdened with a biological alarm system that your ancestors used as a sacrificial early warning light. The comfort you feel in solitude today is just the absence of the terrifying responsibility you would have carried for the last 100,000 years. You are addressed directly by your own DNA every time you feel that pull toward the shadows, reminding you that you aren't here to join the dance around the fire. You are here because in the dark, someone has to be the one who doesn't blink, even if it means you're the only one who sees what's coming for us. To keep this channel going, I genuinely appreciate you subscribing and sharing your thoughts on how your own quiet moments have helped you see things others missed. It's how we keep this rabbit hole open.